The banquet hall of Sultan Murad IV's palace sparkled with golden chandeliers and silk tapestries that cost more than entire villages. Foreign ambassadors sat at tables overflowing with roasted lamb, honeyed figs, and wine from the finest vineyards in the empire. The air smelled of saffron and rosewater. Everything appeared magnificent, civilized, refined. Then the servants entered to refill the wine cups. Not a single sound came from their mouths. Not a greeting, not a whisper, not even the soft exhale of breath that comes with effort. The ambassadors assumed this was simply Ottoman protocol, some show of respect or discipline. They were wrong. When one servant accidentally dropped a silver plate, the crash echoed through the hall. But the servant made no sound of surprise, no gasp, no apology. His mouth opened, revealing only a dark, wet cavity where his tongue should have been. Every servant in that hall had been mutilated. The Sultan's chief physician personally removed their tongues during their first week of service, using a heated iron to cauterize the wound. The survival rate was roughly 60%. Those who died from infection or blood loss were considered fortunate by those who survived. The reasoning was simple and terrifying. Servants who couldn't speak, couldn't reveal secrets, couldn't gossip, couldn't betray what they witnessed in the palace's private chambers. But the tongue removal wasn't performed for practical reasons alone. Sultan Murad had developed a specific obsession. He believed that screams and cries weakened a man's spirit, that suffering should be endured in absolute silence. So he created a palace where pain existed without sound, where agony happened behind smiles and blank expressions. The servants learned quickly. Show emotion and you'd lose more than your tongue. Some lost fingers for crying. Others lost eyes for showing fear. The palace became a theater of silent suffering where everyone performed contentment while experiencing daily torture. The worst part wasn't the initial mutilation. It was watching new servants arrive each month, young men and women selected from across the empire, believing they were receiving the honor of a lifetime. They'd enter those gates with hope in their eyes, imagining comfortable lives, serving the most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. Within a week, they understood their mistake. By the second week, they couldn't even scream about it. The foreign ambassadors finished their meal, complimented the Sultan on his well-trained staff, and returned to their quarters convinced they'd witnessed Ottoman sophistication at its finest. They never noticed the servants' missing tongues, never saw the fear behind those practiced smiles, never understood that every graceful movement was performed under the threat of additional mutilation. The Sultan's reputation for running an orderly, peaceful household remained intact. After all, how could there be suffering in a palace where no one ever screamed? But the missing tongues were just the beginning of what happened behind those marble walls. The Sultan's harem held 300 women. That number alone impressed foreign dignitaries who imagined a life of luxury and pleasure. What they didn't see were the individual cages. The harem wasn't a collection of lavish apartments where women lounged on silk cushions waiting for the Sultan's attention. It was a warren of narrow cells, each barely 6 feet by 6 feet, where women spent 23 hours of every day. The cells had no windows, no furniture except a thin mat on the floor, and iron bars that made them look exactly like what they were. Prisons decorated with expensive tiles. Each morning at dawn, the chief eunuch would unlock the cells for 1 hour. The women could bathe in a communal pool, eat a single meal, and exercise in a small courtyard. Then back into the cages. The chief eunuch kept meticulous records of who showed the proper attitude and who caused trouble. Trouble meant additional hours in the cage, sometimes days without that single hour of freedom. Some women went weeks seeing nothing but the inside of their decorated cells. The Sultan visited the harem perhaps once or twice a month. He'd walk down the corridor of cages like a man shopping for livestock, pointing at whichever woman caught his attention that evening. The chosen one would be cleaned, perfumed, dressed in fine clothes, and brought to his chambers. If she pleased him, she might receive gifts, better food, perhaps even a slightly larger cage. If she didn't, she'd return to her cell and wouldn't be selected again for months, left to rot in that 6x6 space while younger, more eager women took her place. But here's where the psychological torture became truly sophisticated. The Sultan deliberately selected women who had been rivals, sisters, or friends before entering the harem. He'd favor one while forcing the other to watch from her cage. Women who had once been close became bitter enemies, competing desperately for those rare moments of freedom that came with the Sultan's attention. The chief eunuch encouraged this competition, spreading rumors about who the Sultan preferred, creating hierarchies that changed weekly based on nothing but his whims. Fatma, a Greek woman who'd been captured during a raid, spent 11 years in a harem cage. For the first 3 years, the Sultan called for her regularly. She received privileges, better food, a cage with a small window. Then he lost interest. She went from weekly visits to monthly, then to nothing at all. For 8 years she existed in that cage, let out for 1 hour each day, watching younger women receive the favor she'd once enjoyed. By the time she died at 32, she'd spent over 70,000 hours staring at the same tiled walls. The medical report said heart failure. The other women knew better. She'd died of hopelessness, her spirit crushed by the absolute certainty that nothing would ever change. The worst cases were the women who went insane. Every few months, someone would start screaming during the night, banging against the bars until their hands bled, tearing at their own hair and skin. The chief eunuch had a protocol for this. The woman would be moved to a special cage in the deepest part of the harem, where her screams couldn't disturb the others. There she'd be left in complete darkness until she either went silent or died. Some lasted weeks in those darkness cages. Most didn't make it past a few days. The Sultan justified this system with remarkable logic. These women were protected, fed, housed in a palace. They wore fine clothes and ate good food. They should be grateful for such luxury. The fact that they were prisoners didn't matter to him. The fact that many would have chosen death over this existence never crossed his mind. He saw himself as generous, providing for hundreds of women who would otherwise be living in poverty. The cages were for their own protection, he claimed, keeping them safe and pure. Foreign visitors occasionally asked about the harem. The Sultan would show them the bathing pools, the courtyard, the fine decorations. He never showed them the cages. He never mentioned that most of these women would die without ever leaving the palace, never seeing their families again, never experiencing anything beyond that 1-hour daily release and the occasional night in the Sultan's bed. To the outside world, the harem represented the height of Ottoman luxury. To the women inside, it was a slow death sentence dressed up in silk and gold. While the women suffered in gilded cages, the male servants faced something far worse. The palace required eunuchs, lots of them. They guarded the harem, served in the private quarters, and handled sensitive documents that regular servants couldn't be trusted with. The Sultan needed at least 200 eunuchs at all times to maintain palace operations. This created a simple problem with a horrifying solution. Where do you get 200 castrated men when castration frequently results in death? You make more than you need. Every 3 months, the palace purchased 50 boys from slave markets across the empire. They ranged from 8 to 14 years old, selected specifically because younger bodies supposedly healed better after the procedure. The boys arrived at the palace believing they'd been chosen for prestigious positions. In a way, they had been. Just not the kind anyone would want. The castration chamber sat in the palace's lowest level, a stone room that never fully dried because of all the blood that soaked into the floor. The palace employed 2 castrators who worked in shifts during procurement months. Their technique was brutally efficient. The boy would be held down by 4 adult servants while the castrator used a curved blade to remove everything, not just the testicles, everything. Complete removal meant no sexual desire whatsoever, which made eunuchs more trustworthy in the Sultan's eyes. The blade cut deep. Then came the cauterization, a red-hot iron pressed against the wound to stop the bleeding. The boys were allowed to scream during this part. Unlike the tongue removals, the Sultan enjoyed hearing these screams. He believed the pain of castration marked the death of the boy's old life, and the birth of his new existence as a palace servant. It was, in his twisted logic, a spiritual experience. After cauterization, each boy was given a wooden plug to insert into his urethra to keep it open while the wound healed. Without this plug, the urethra would seal shut and the boy would die within days from his bladder rupturing. The plug had to stay in place for 3 weeks. It caused constant burning agony. Many boys tried to remove it in their sleep. The palace chained their hands to prevent this. The survival rate hovered around 40%. Out of every 50 boys castrated, roughly 20 survived the first month. The others died from infection, shock, or blood loss despite the cauterization. Their bodies were thrown into a mass grave outside the palace walls. No records were kept of their names or where they'd come from. They simply disappeared, replaced by the next shipment of boys 3 months later. Those who survived faced a hierarchy more cruel than death. The eunuchs were ranked based on when they'd been castrated and how well they'd healed. Those castrated youngest and who healed without complications became high-ranking eunuchs, given positions of authority. Those who healed poorly, whose wounds became infected and left them in constant pain, were relegated to the lowest tasks: cleaning chamber pots, scrubbing floors, disposing of waste. The palace created a class system based entirely on surgical outcomes. The chief eunuch, a man named Sultan, who'd been castrated at age 9 and had served for 38 years, ran this system with absolute cruelty. He remembered his own castration, remembered the pain and fear, and showed no mercy to the new boys because no one had shown mercy to him. He personally supervised each castration, offering advice to the castrators on improving their technique. He kept detailed notes on which boys screamed the loudest, which ones begged, which ones stayed silent. These notes determined future assignments. But here's where the system became truly nightmarish. After serving 10 years, senior eunuchs were required to assist with castrations. They had to hold down the boys, hand instruments to the castrators, and apply the cauterizing irons. The Sultan believed this created loyalty. Men who participated in the creation of new eunuchs were less likely to sympathize with them, less likely to help them escape or rebel. It worked. The senior eunuchs became the most ruthless enforcers of the system, treating new arrivals with contempt and cruelty. One eunuch named Mehmet lasted 42 years in palace service. During that time, he personally assisted with over 800 castrations. He kept a private count, marking each one on the wall of his quarters. Near the end of his life, when age and illness left him bedridden, other eunuchs reported hearing him scream in his sleep, reliving every castration he'd witnessed and assisted. He died alone in his quarters, his final words reportedly being an apology to boys whose faces he could no longer remember. The palace burned through human lives with industrial efficiency. Every year, 200 boys entered those gates. Every year, fewer than 80 survived. The rest died in agony or from complications that could have been prevented with basic medical care. But the Sultan didn't care about survival rates. He cared about having enough eunuchs to run his palace. The dead boys were simply the cost of doing business, replaced as easily as broken furniture. But even the eunuchs had it better than those who served in the kitchen. The palace kitchens prepared over 500 dishes daily. Every meal the Sultan consumed required testing, not by adult servants who might build immunity or develop tricks to survive, by children. The poison testers were purchased from the poorest families in Constantinople. Parents sold their children knowing exactly what would happen to them. A single child could be traded for enough money to feed the rest of the family for 6 months. The transaction was simple and brutal. The palace needed a constant supply of testers, and desperate families needed money. The market operated openly, with agents visiting slums twice monthly to select healthy children between ages 5 and 10. The children lived in a special wing of the palace, kept separate from other servants. They received good food, comfortable beds, and careful medical monitoring, not out of kindness, but to ensure they remained healthy enough to fulfill their purpose. A sick child couldn't accurately test for poison. The palace needed them in perfect condition right up until the moment they died. Here's how it worked. Every dish prepared for the Sultan was tested by 3 children. The first child ate a full portion and waited 30 minutes. If nothing happened, the second child ate from the same dish. Another 30-minute wait. Then the third child. Only after all 3 survived would the dish be sent to the Sultan's table. The children tested food 3 times daily: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's 9 exposures per day to potentially poisoned food. The average survival time was 6 months. Some children lasted a year if they were lucky. The unlucky ones died within weeks. Poison affected children faster than adults, making them ideal testers, but guaranteeing rapid turnover. The palace maintained a roster of 30 children at all times, knowing that half would be dead within 6 months and need replacement. The deaths were rarely quick. Arsenic, the most common poison of the era, caused violent stomach cramps, bloody vomit, and seizures that could last for hours. The children would collapse in the testing room, writhing on the floor while physicians took notes on their symptoms. These notes helped identify which specific poison had been used, information that supposedly justified the child's suffering. Once a child started showing symptoms, they were moved to an isolation room to die. The palace couldn't risk other children seeing the deaths and refusing to eat. A girl named Aishi holds the record for longest survival. She worked as a poison tester for 14 months, testing over 1,200 dishes. She developed chronic stomach problems, lost most of her hair, and her skin took on a grayish tone from accumulated toxin exposure. The palace physicians marveled at her resilience, studying her as if she were a curiosity rather than a dying child. When she finally collapsed after testing a lamb stew laced with belladonna, she lingered for 3 days, blind and paralyzed, before her heart stopped. The physicians documented everything, noting that her resistance to poison had likely developed through micro-exposures that would have killed a less resilient child immediately. The children understood their fate. The older ones, those who'd survived past 3 months, would comfort newer arrivals by lying. They'd say that children who tested enough food without incident eventually graduated to better positions in the palace. This lie gave the younger children hope, made them more willing to eat questionable dishes. In truth, no poison tester ever left that wing alive. The palace couldn't risk former testers sharing information about security procedures they'd witnessed. Parents who sold their children occasionally asked palace agents what happened to them. The agents always said the same thing: "Your child serves the Sultan faithfully and lives in comfort." Some parents believed this. Others knew better, but took the money anyway, because starvation kills just as surely as poison, only slower and more painfully. The truly haunting detail is that the palace kept portraits of the poison testers, not as memorial, but as medical reference. Each child's portrait was painted when they arrived, healthy and alive. Then again at 3 months, showing early signs of toxin exposure. Finally, a death portrait was painted within hours of their passing. These 3-stage portraits lined the walls of the chief physician's office, a gallery of deterioration that documented exactly what chronic poison exposure did to a young body. Skin lesions, hair loss, sunken eyes, swollen joints. The progression was remarkably consistent across all children. The Sultan occasionally visited the testing wing, observing from behind a screen as children ate dishes prepared for him. He found it reassuring. Watching these small bodies absorb poison meant for him. It confirmed his importance, proved that his life was worth more than theirs. Some reports suggest he developed a superstitious belief that each child's death transferred their remaining lifespan to him, that he was literally feeding on their vitality to extend his own existence. And when these children died, their bodies revealed the Sultan's darkest addiction. The palace had subterranean levels that most servants never saw. 3 floors beneath the main structure, accessible only through a locked staircase in the Sultan's private quarters, lay what he called his gardens. No sunlight reached these chambers. No flowers grew there. What grew instead were plants that killed. Sultan Murad IV had developed an obsession with toxicology that went far beyond simple paranoia about assassination. He wanted to understand poison at a molecular level, wanted to catalog every toxic plant in the known world and determine exactly how each one destroyed the human body. His underground gardens contained specimens collected from across 3 continents. Hemlock from Greece, nightshade from Europe, oleander from Persia, and dozens of other species that could end a life in minutes or drag out death for weeks. But plants alone weren't enough. The Sultan needed to test them, not on animals, which he considered unreliable models, but on humans. The poison tester children provided some data, but their deaths were rushed, contaminated by multiple exposures. The Sultan wanted controlled experiments with single subjects and carefully measured doses, so he created a laboratory. The underground chambers held 20 cells, each containing a prisoner. These weren't criminals or political enemies. Those people had value as examples or bargaining chips. These were nobodies. Homeless people grabbed from Constantinople's streets, travelers who'd entered the city without proper documentation, occasionally servants who'd committed minor infractions that normally warranted dismissal, but whom the Sultan found more useful as test subjects. Once someone entered those underground cells, they ceased to exist in any official record. The experiments followed scientific protocols that were remarkably sophisticated for the era. The Sultan maintained detailed journals documenting every test: subject age, weight, general health, type of poison administered, dosage, method of delivery, time until first symptoms appeared, progression of symptoms, time of death, condition of the body after death. His journals filled 17 volumes by the time of his death, representing over 4,000 individual poisoning experiments. Some experiments focused on speed. How quickly could various poisons kill a healthy adult? The Sultan discovered that cyanide derived from bitter almonds could stop a heart in under 3 minutes, while arsenic might take days. He recorded the exact moment when each subject's pupils dilated, when breathing became labored, when consciousness faded. His notes showed no emotion, no acknowledgement that he was watching human beings die in agony. Just clinical observations about biological processes. Other experiments examined suffering. Which poisons caused the most pain? Which ones caused paralysis while leaving the victim conscious? Which affected the mind before the body? The Sultan seemed particularly fascinated by poisons that destroyed a person's sanity before killing them. He'd administer sub-lethal doses of mercury or lead over weeks, documenting the gradual mental deterioration. Subjects would start seeing things that weren't there, having conversations with invisible people, forgetting their own names. Then he'd dissect their brains after death to see if he could identify physical changes that corresponded to the madness. The most disturbing experiments involved healing. The Sultan wanted to know if poison damage could be reversed. He'd poison a subject to the point of near death, then attempt various treatments to save them. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, induced vomiting, prayer. When a treatment worked, he'd document it carefully, then poison the same subject again with a different toxin to test other remedies. Some prisoners went through this cycle 5 or 6 times, brought to death's edge and pulled back repeatedly until their bodies finally gave out. A man named Dmitri survived in those underground cells for 11 months. Palace records show he was subjected to 43 separate poisoning experiments. His body developed unusual reactions after the first few months. Poisons that should have killed him quickly barely made him sick. The Sultan became obsessed with Dmitri, convinced he'd found a man with natural immunity to toxins. He increased dosages, tried more exotic poisons, combined different toxins to see if mixing them would overcome Dmitri's resistance. Finally, he administered a dose of raw mercury so massive that Dmitri's organs liquefied within hours. The autopsy revealed a liver covered in scar tissue and kidneys that had essentially ceased functioning weeks earlier. Dmitri had been a dead man walking, his body held together by nothing but stubborn biology. The Sultan didn't conduct these experiments alone. He trained a team of physicians in his methods, creating what was essentially a school of toxicology built on human suffering. These physicians competed for the Sultan's favor by developing new experimental protocols or discovering novel poisonous compounds. The most successful physician, a man named Ibrahim, personally conducted over 800 experiments. He developed a classification system for poisons based on symptom progression that was actually quite sophisticated, but built entirely on data gathered from watching prisoners die. The underground gardens also served another purpose. The Sultan regularly descended to those chambers when palace life stressed him. He found the experiments calming, therapeutic. Watching poison destroy a human body gave him a sense of control that he couldn't find anywhere else. As his reign progressed and political pressures mounted, he spent more time underground. Sometimes entire days would pass with the Sultan in those chambers, personally administering poisons and documenting results while the empire above him struggled without leadership. His physicians grew concerned, not about the experiments, which they considered legitimate scientific research, but about the Sultan's increasing isolation and obsessive focus. He stopped attending state functions, ignored visiting dignitaries, and left administrative duties to ministers he barely supervised. The empire was falling apart, while its ruler sat in a basement, poisoning homeless people and taking notes. But nothing could prepare the empire for what happened when the Sultan himself became the final victim. Sultan Murad IV died on February 8, 1640, at age 27. The official cause of death was recorded as gout and cirrhosis. That was a lie. The truth was far stranger and more fitting. The Sultan's obsession with poison had consequences he never anticipated. Years of working with toxic plants in poorly ventilated underground chambers had resulted in chronic exposure. He'd breathed in spores from nightshade, gotten sap from oleander on his skin, absorbed trace amounts of dozens of different toxins through casual contact with his specimens. Each exposure was minor, not enough to cause immediate symptoms, but they accumulated over time. By his mid-20s, the Sultan had begun experiencing strange symptoms. Tremors in his hands, periods of confusion and memory loss, sudden fits of rage followed by exhaustion. His physicians couldn't identify the cause because they'd never seen chronic multi-toxin exposure before. The Sultan himself didn't connect his symptoms to his experiments. He assumed he was just working too hard and needed more time in his gardens. So he spent even more hours underground, exposing himself to higher concentrations of poison. The final weeks of his life were grotesque. His skin took on a yellowish tint. His hair fell out in clumps. He developed open sores that wouldn't heal. His breath smelled like bitter almonds, a telltale sign of cyanide exposure. He couldn't keep food down and lost over 40 pounds. His mind deteriorated rapidly. He'd forget conversations minutes after having them, accuse servants of crimes they hadn't committed, and spend hours staring at walls while muttering about flowers that were trying to kill him. The chief physician finally understood what was happening during the Sultan's last week. He examined the underground gardens, tested the air quality, and realized the chambers were saturated with toxic compounds. 17 years of poison experiments had contaminated everything. The stone walls had absorbed toxins. The ventilation system circulated poisoned air throughout the underground levels. Simply existing in those chambers for extended periods was enough to cause chronic poisoning. The Sultan had been killing himself slowly every time he descended those stairs. But by the time the physician made this discovery, it was too late. The damage was irreversible. The Sultan's liver was failing. His kidneys had stopped processing waste, and his brain showed signs of severe deterioration. He spent his final 3 days in bed, unable to speak coherently, his body convulsing as his organs shut down one by one. The physicians tried everything they'd learned from the underground experiments, every remedy they documented. Nothing worked. The man who'd poisoned thousands couldn't be saved from his own toxins. The autopsy was performed by the same physicians who'd assisted with the Sultan's experiments. What they found was remarkable and horrifying. Nearly every organ showed signs of damage from multiple toxic compounds. His liver looked like a sponge, filled with holes where tissue had died and been absorbed. His kidneys were shriveled and blackened. His heart had enlarged to nearly twice normal size, working desperately to pump blood through a body that was essentially one massive wound. But the most disturbing discovery was in his brain. When they opened his skull, they found that portions of his brain tissue had turned green. Green. The tissue had absorbed so much copper and mercury that it had literally changed color. The physicians had never seen anything like it. They'd conducted thousands of poison experiments and dissected hundreds of bodies, but they'd never witnessed this level of contamination in a living person. The Sultan had been walking around with a brain that was more chemical compound than human tissue. The physicians documented everything in their journals, noting the irony that their patron had become the most valuable research subject of all. His death provided data they could never have gathered from prisoners. This was a complete multi-year poisoning case study from exposure to death, all in one body. They measured, weighed, and preserved his organs for future reference, treating their dead sultan like just another experiment. The empire tried to give Sultan Murad IV a proper funeral. They cleaned his body, dressed him in fine robes, and prepared him for burial according to Islamic tradition. But his body had deteriorated so severely that it couldn't be displayed for the traditional viewing. His skin had taken on a green-gray tone that cosmetics couldn't hide. The smell of rot was overwhelming despite the embalming attempts. His face had sunken in on itself, making him unrecognizable. They sealed the coffin quickly and buried him within hours of death, breaking protocol but necessary to avoid public panic. The underground gardens were sealed immediately after the Sultan's death. His successor ordered the ventilation shafts blocked, the entrance walled over, and the entire area condemned. The toxic contamination was too severe to clean safely. Those chambers remain sealed to this day, somewhere beneath what's left of the palace, still saturated with 17 years of accumulated poison. The final irony came months after the Sultan's death. The physicians who'd performed his autopsy began showing symptoms: tremors, confusion, skin discoloration. They'd been exposed during the examination, handling organs so contaminated that merely touching them was dangerous. 3 of the 5 physicians died within a year, their bodies showing the same multi-toxin damage as the Sultan's. The remaining 2 survived, but suffered chronic health problems for the rest of their lives. The empire covered up the true cause of death. Official histories recorded Sultan Murad IV as dying from disease, a young ruler taken too soon by illness. They buried the autopsy reports, burned the experimental journals, and executed servants who knew the truth about the underground gardens. The story of a sultan who poisoned himself through his own obsession was too embarrassing, too bizarre, too revealing of the palace's true nature. But the palace itself remembered. For decades after, servants reported strange smells coming from the sealed chambers. Maintenance workers refused to go near that section of the palace. Some claimed to hear sounds from behind the walls, though that was likely just pipes settling or rats in the infrastructure. The toxic legacy of Sultan Murad IV had literally become part of the palace's foundation, a permanent reminder that the tortures inflicted within those walls eventually consumed even their architect. The man who'd created an empire of suffering had become its final victim, destroyed by the very tools he'd used to destroy others. His body, saturated with the poisons he'd spent years studying, became a monument to the simple truth that cruelty has a price, and sometimes that price is paid in your own corrupted flesh. The palace that had eaten thousands of lives finally ate its master, and his death was as grotesque and meaningless as all the deaths he'd caused. The torturer, tortured. The poisoner, poisoned. The builder of nightmares, consumed by his own creation. And in those sealed chambers beneath the palace, the plants still grow in the dark, their roots feeding on 17 years of accumulated death, waiting for someone foolish enough to open those doors again.